good morning. It's good to be here today, mainly because I thought I wouldn't be. Yesterday we went tubing, and the river's still high, real high. It didn't. Usually does. So it turned out to be like one of the best tubing experiences I've ever had, because it was like tubing on the Whitewater Rapids. But I gotta tell you, going towards it, we got out of our vehicle, we walked to the edge of the water, which is now like 5 feet tall. You know, you've been in the river enough to where you know where it should be, and it's not. And you're like, well, there's usually a cliff right here we have to step down. Well, that's underwater. But I walked to the edge of it, and I looked out there, and I just said, God, you better be real. But we did it. It was great. It was a blast. I had a lot of fun. But it was big, huge waves. It was awesome. It was really great. And yeah, we didn't drag at all. That's usually the worst part about it. But I'm glad to be here today because I thought I may not be. But anyway, we are still in our Bible Doesn't Say That series. Last week, we talked about how, actually, it was the root of evil before that, and then we talked about how obedience always leads to the acquiring of funds and whatnot, I guess, for lack of a better word. And then we've talked about how other things that are in the Bible, like cleanliness is next to godliness, that's not necessarily in there. But today, we're continuing along in this series with something that I think is really important, something that everybody is affected with. And I feel like if the way we view this statement changes, it can really change a lot of different pieces in our life. This kind of influences all the decisions that we make. It influences how we respond to the choices and then the conclusion of said choices. And I think if we understand this at a different level, this one, more than the other ones we've talked about so far, would really change our outlook on life. And that's this. We often believe that suffering always comes from sin. We think that if we do something wrong, if we do something that God doesn't like, if we do a sin knowingly, that inevitably the suffering will come. And then when that suffering does, we can look back and we go, well, that's because you did this. That's because you had this sin in your life. In fact, I won't forget that a lot of times in church you hear people say that. You hear people talk about the suffering that they're going through, the problems, the struggles. And somebody else will say, well, what have you been doing these last couple weeks? That's probably why. And that's just not true. That's not in the Bible. We often go, what did we do wrong? I don't get it. I was doing so well, and now all of a sudden I'm suffering. It had to be something I did. God, why are you letting this happening? Why is this happening to me? What did I do? Where did I go wrong? Now, I know here we talk a lot about suffering as well as the change that's required to get through it. But our perspective of that suffering, the understanding of that suffering in our life, and knowing why it exists will really push us to a new place as believers. And we have to get over asking this question. We have to get over trying to figure out, what did I do wrong? Because that's not why suffering exists. Now, often there too, we become people who try to take care of the suffering in our life. We look at whether or not the choice we're going to be at is less suffering than the one that we're at. Often we don't move forward until the suffering that we're going to be in is less suffering than where we are now. We often look at that when it comes to jobs. That job may not be a perfect solution, but is it less problems than where I'm at now? Well, then I might take it. And when you look at decisions and choices that way, you really don't take in all of the information. You don't make the best guided decisions. Because now you're not trying to decide if it's what's best for you. You're just trying to go the path of least resistance. You're just trying to end up with the least amount of suffering. And then your decisions are guided by that, not by what's best for you or your family or your kids or your money or your home. And we get caught up and lost in that. Because now all we're focusing on is whether or not we're suffering less than we are right now. We have really become experts at suffering management. We look at all the areas in our lives and we try to decide which one will be less suffering. When we discipline our children, we look at them and we decide what will cause less suffering. When we go to work, we try to see who we can avoid so we have less suffering. We really become experts at this side of our lives. We stop making intelligent decisions. We stop trying to find all the information. We stop trying to understand how we got to where we are. and instead just how to not go somewhere that's worse. And then we don't have any joy in life. Because now we're not looking for those sweet spots. We're not looking for the times we're excited about life or we're joyous about life. Instead, we're just trying to make life as painless as possible. We get lost. We get caught up. And we really go back to this all the time. Suffering always comes from sin, and that's just not true. Where you're at right now, what you're dealing with right now, the problems, the darkness that's in you, the pain, that's not because you did something wrong. That's not because of a sin in your life. That's not because you betrayed God to a certain extent. It's because suffering is part of life. Suffering is something we all run into at one point or another, and it doesn't matter how good you are at life, you will encounter suffering at one point or another. Now, there's no story better in the Bible, I think, than the one of Job. A lot of you have probably heard that. You've probably heard us talk about it a lot because it's a really good example of how to deal with the suffering in your life. But more importantly today, what we're looking at is the fact that we say things like suffering always comes from sin. And if that's the case, then this story would be a whole lot different. If you know the story of Job, or if you don't, here's the rundown. Job was a great man. He had everything he could ever want. He had the family he could always depend on. He had all the money, he had all the cattle, he had all the land, he had everything he could ever desire. And then one day, God made a deal with the devil because the devil said, I bet I can get this guy to turn on you. And God said, well, you can do anything you want to him but kill him. And God pulled back and he let the devil do his work. The devil took it all away, every last thing he had, to the point to where he's sitting in a pile of dust covered in a disease of boils, scraping them away with nothing, suffering. And eventually, he proved that he wouldn't turn his back on God. God rewarded him, and he gave it back to him twice what he had. What's interesting about this story is, yes, we can look at it and we can learn from it on how to deal with the suffering in our lives, how to deal with the pain in our lives. But what we have to know from this story is that Job didn't do anything wrong. He didn't deserve this. The very first verse in the book of Job was this. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He didn't deserve this. He didn't sin to the point to where this happened to him. So here's a perfect example to the contrary on the fact that suffering always comes from the sin in our lives. That's not how sin works. But we do know that suffering is part of our lives. We do know that we'll all get to that point. We do know that eventually the people that were above us in age will be gone and the people below us in age are the only ones left. We'll lose someone to a disease that shouldn't have been lost now. We'll get one ourselves and have to deal with it. We'll lose our jobs, we'll lose our money, the bills will pile up, the kids will go away. Things will happen in our life that are dark, dreary, nasty. How do we deal with that? How do we experience the amazingness that is God when everything in our life goes wrong? How is it that we can still look up to him and praise him in the midst of things we can't control that hurt us and tear us down and leave us a wreck? How could a good God do that to us? We have to ask ourselves, how do we deal with the suffering in our life? What's the purpose of it? Why is it here? So now that we know that suffering exists, why? Why must we suffer? Let's look at this. Let's look at this together. Let's work through this together because we need to know how to get through suffering. First and foremost, this group of people here, why we're here today, why this church exists, is not so someone can speak to you. It's not so we can have a great band. It's not so you can have cookies out front. It's because we're a group of people here that work together, that help each other, that lift people up in the midst of their suffering. And you need to know that regardless of where you're at and regardless of where this message leads, that we are here together. That me up here is not any different than you out there. We all suffer, we all have pain, and we're all here to lift each other up. And you know what? I don't understand those who don't see the value in a church that comes together and helps each other, regardless of the sins in their life, regardless of the nastiness, but instead to lift them up and show them the face of God. which says, I love you regardless of the suffering, regardless of the sin in your life. So remember, as we go through this, we have a group of people here that cares about you. The staff cares about you. I care about you. Marlon cares about you. We built this church so we could be a group of people who takes care of each other. And we can get through anything because of it. So why must we suffer? Let's look at this. Why must we deal with this suffering? Today, if you're dealing with something like this, I hope this helps because we need to know how to get through this suffering. There's this great story in John 9. It starts like this. It says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. This is Jesus. His disciples asked Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So here's this man, he's on the side of the road. We know that he was born blind. We know that he's begging. Later on in the verses, it talks about that. So even his parents, which are still alive at the time of this story, didn't have the funds to even take care of their blind son. So what he had to do was beg every day with his cup or with his box or whatever it was. He sat out in the street and begged because he couldn't do anything because he was blind. So of course the disciples, like many of us, I believe, if given the opportunity to talk to Jesus, would ask Jesus straight out, why did this happen? Why is this man blind? Why is he suffering? Who did it? Was it his parents before him? Was it him? What did he do wrong to deserve this? And see, what's interesting about that question is we really kind of avoid the truth of the matter, which is that we detest the suffering that we see. We ask the question because we don't want to see that for anybody, and we don't want to see it for ourselves. And we could probably get some sort of relief if we just simply knew why. If someone could say, yes, it's because his dad did this, we could point the finger, and we could feel better about it. We could feel better about the suffering that is inherent in this world, because now we at least have someone to blame. And when we have someone to blame, it takes the responsibility off of our own shoulders. Now I don't have to worry about what I'm doing or what I'm saying or where I'm going, but instead I can point a finger at this person and say, it's your fault that I'm here. It's your fault that you're here. And then we remove that responsibility for ourselves. So the question, I think, is inherent to all of us. We all ask this question. If you've lost somebody recently, or if you lost your stuff, or you lost your home, or you're in the middle of some form of suffering, you can't find love, you feel lonely, this question, I know, is probably in your mind. And it's an easy one to ask. Everybody asks it because it might just give us a little bit of relief. Now, if anybody knows who Tim Keller is, he's a great speaker. He's an amazing guy. I watched a lot of his videos. He is just a master at answering tough questions in a way that is acceptable to anybody. Tim Keller was on this panel once, and a guy who had been part of a Catholic church for almost 12 years, actually it was Catholic school, Catholic school for 12 years, came out the other side an atheist. And he's sitting here with Tim Keller, who's a professed theologian to some degree, pastor. And he said, I went through all of this in my life. I was part of the Catholic church, was part of the Catholic school for so much time. And it occurred to me that I couldn't believe there was a God because of the Holocaust. I couldn't believe that God, a loving, caring God such as himself, would allow such horrendous suffering in this world. And for that reason, I don't believe. Now, first of all, Tim Keller said to him, well, I think that it's harder now to accept the pain in this world if you don't have a higher power, because now it's just the strong eating the weak. If you don't believe there's a God, then you have to look at something like the Holocaust and say, well, that's just life. You have to be okay with it. But now that we know who God is, and now that we know who Jesus is, we know that he's real, we can look at that differently. And when we ask this question, we can look at it differently. And the guy said, I just can't believe that there was any good reason for the Holocaust to happen and for a loving God to let that happen to his people. And Tim Keller said this. He said, you can't assume just because you can't think of a reason there wasn't one. We can't assume that us, human beings who are fallible, who make mistakes, who don't always choose the right thing, could ever comprehend a reason from something like that. We can't assume that we know God so well that we can say, you screwed up here. We can't assume that we know God's mind. So in the midst of our suffering, we'll instead say, I have a better idea of how this should have went down. Where were you? We can't assume that just because we can't think of a reason for our current suffering or for somebody else's suffering, that there isn't one. Because God is all-knowing. He created everything. We're here today because of him, and we might never know the answer. We might never know the reason while we're here on this earth. Now, continuing with the story with Jesus, Jesus was walking down the street. He encountered the blind man. They asked him, who sinned, the father or him? The blind man sinned, maybe to cause it to be where it was. And Jesus had this answer. He said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. That's not a good answer. Nobody likes that. Now I don't have anybody to blame. Now I can't make someone feel responsible for their failings. Now I can't point a finger anymore. Now suffering is just suffering for suffering's sake. That's no good. How do I understand who God is if I can't understand why we go through the pain and the suffering that we're in? That doesn't make me feel good when I've lost a parent or I've lost a sibling or I've lost a child. That doesn't make me feel good. I see the way we look at suffering really is going to change if we look at an answer like this and we say, that's not what I wanted. You can't feel good about that. You see, what we need to know is that sin brought with it suffering disconnected from any one particular sin. Adam and Eve, it was perfect. They were in the garden. Everything was great. They were doing whatever they wanted. And they didn't have to worry about the sin because there wasn't sin. And then this tree came along and this nasty snake. And next thing you know, sin was brought into this world. And here it was. And along with it came the suffering, pain in childbirth. That's suffering. Men, you think you got off easy, but we still got to work the fields, right? That was our curse, that we would work and toil away forever. That we would work and work and work. And those things that came from that, the childbirth and the working of the fields and the toiling of the way, that wasn't because one particular sin. That just came along with sin. And sin today is the same. Suffering is not tied to sin. Because you sin does not mean you will suffer. That doesn't mean that you won't learn from it or be punished because of it or be treated differently through that process as you begin to learn what you did and the sin that was in your life through Christ. But it does not mean that because of the suffering you're experiencing was because of one particular moment. And we need to disconnect those things. If we don't disconnect the sin from the suffering, then we just drive ourselves mad trying to figure out what we could do differently next time to avoid the suffering that we're in now. But if we know that life is suffering, life is pain, life is groaning for the amazingness of God, that changes our perspective. Because now we've stopped looking for a reason. Now we understand that it's not a cause issue. It's a purpose issue. It's not about what caused that man to be born blind. You'll never figure that out. It's not about the cause of that. If you look at the fact that he's blind now, and you try to use that as a reason to figure out why he's blind, that doesn't work. But instead, we need to look at a purpose, and that's what Jesus was saying. He's saying, you see, the father didn't sin, the mother didn't sin, he didn't sin. The cause of where he's at didn't put him here. John Piper says, cause is never the decisive explanation of anything. Anything. Look at aspects of your life that aren't directly related to God. You don't look at the cause of the situation. You don't scrape your knee and then blame the scraped knee on something else. Instead, you figure out how you got to that point. Cause is never a reason to look back to try and figure out how it happened, but instead to look at a purpose. Why am I where I am now? You see, when we're kids, we're taught by our parents really hard lessons, and we don't understand them. And our young, childish minds try to figure out what we did to deserve the spanking that we got. And it never works. That's why we get mad at our dads. That's why we get mad at our moms, because we're trying to figure out why we got spanked and why someone that loved us so much would do such a thing. And then when we get older, we do this crazy thing. We look back and we go, I deserved that. You see how that changes? When we're kids, we're trying to figure out the cause of the spanking. When we're older, we loved the fact we got it because we deserved it. Because if you start to look at the pain and the suffering in your life from the perspective of purpose, why it's happening, why I'm getting here, then it's no longer about the cause of it. It's not about, God, why aren't you here? It's about, God, how can we get out of here? How can we move forward together? How can we move through this together? Not why am I here? Not woe is me. Not I'm a victim. But how can I grow up and change and move forward and get through it and experience suffering differently? That's hard. I know this is a really downer message, but man, we live in a world filled with suffering. There's time after time we're good people and we feel that we deserve something better. And when we don't get it, we just fall to pieces. Because now we've equated sin to where we are. And you know what? If we didn't get anything good in this life because of the sin in our lives, we would have nothing. Because we all sin. And those who don't believe in Christ then would get nothing too. But then we wouldn't be able to say, but look at them. They don't believe in Christ and they get all kinds of good things. We always compare our lives to those people. And that's because sin is not connected to your suffering. Suffering is the way of the world. And if we don't understand how to look at it, not because of the cause of where we are, but instead the purpose of getting through it, we will forever compare our lives to those who get things when we don't. Life is suffering. Life is pain. Life is deep. Life is dark sometimes. And we need to know how to get through it. So where's the purpose? Where do we find this? How do we know purpose? I know you're struggling with something now. I know you're dealing with a lost loved one. You're dealing with a lack of finances in your life. You're dealing with a lack of drive or meaning. Maybe you're doing the same thing over and over again. You just can't find joy in anything. Maybe you're alone. Maybe there's nobody in this world who understands you. Maybe there's nobody in this world who can help you. We need to find purpose. Purpose is the difference between finding a reason to live and committing suicide. Purpose is the difference between standing up and moving forward, even in the midst of nastiness and struggle and pain, or just staying where you are instead, because at least here I'm not suffering more than I would if I got up and moved. Purpose is the difference maker. Because then we stop looking at cause, we stop looking at why, and we start looking at how. How do we get through this? How do we learn from this? How do we become better because of this? So where's the purpose? As we said before, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Talking about the blind man again, he said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Again, we're given another answer where we're going, what? Did God make him this way? Did God make him blind? How fair is that? That's not fair. I thought life was supposed to be good. We look at, my wife works for an amazing program at Mosaic where all the time she has to deal with people with mental and physical disabilities. And we tend to look at people like that and go, what kind of a God could allow such nasty things to happen to people? Does he love us or not? Because if he did, he wouldn't put us in this position. And here again, he says that. He says, but this happens so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Really? God made him blind? God's the guy who created everything. He's the guy who knew. See, when we see that verse, then we have to ask ourselves this question. Was this man accidentally born blind? Did Jesus just happen along a man who couldn't see? Was it just a mistake? Whoops. Oh, here's someone. Maybe I'll help him. Or do we truly believe that God has created everything? God knew from the moment that this person was being born. He knew that when the sperm was fertilizing that egg and the DNA would combine in such a way that this person would be born blind. And he said, go, be born. We truly believe it's just an accident. If we believe that it was an accident, then again, it has no meaning. It's just the strong eating the weak. It's just life, and we have to be okay with that. But if we truly believe that God has a purpose, that this person was born blind for a reason, then we no longer look at the cause. Instead, we see the suffering and we go, how can God be glorified through it? And that changes everything. Because I don't believe this man was accidentally born blind. I don't believe God had his back turned for a moment and one of them slipped by. I don't believe that God had no plan for him and Jesus just happened to be on the same street as this man at that day, at that time, and saw him and did a miracle. I don't believe it was an accident. It says this in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We know that if we believe in God, we believe in Jesus, we know that he's all powerful, that he will work all things to the good. It says it right there. We can know that in our suffering and in our problems and in the nastiness and the darkness and the times where we feel like he's not here, that it's working for his good. You can lose somebody. You can lose a family member. You can lose all your money. You can end up on the street. You can have absolutely nothing. And you can still take confidence in the fact that God works all things to your good. See, that's purpose. That's not cause. He didn't say that if you lose all your money, I'll make sure you're taken care of. He didn't say, I know you're dealing with the fact that you lost your father, but I'll take care of you. He didn't talk about specific things. Instead, he said all things. He's saying you're in the midst of it now. You're in the midst of the suffering, and I will take care of it. Do we believe that? Do we really know that God's in control? Because suffering only makes sense when it's related to God. As soon as you don't have God, suffering just becomes another aspect of life. And you have to be okay with it. You have to be okay with other people's suffering. Because without God, you have nothing to compare it to. You see, those people, those disciples who said, who sinned? Who caused it for this man to be blind? Whose fault was it? See what's amazing about that is Jesus was alive at that time, and then he started to move towards the darkness in his life. He carried the cross to Calvary, was nailed to it, he died. And you have to wonder if somebody somewhere was going, what did he do? Who sinned that Jesus would suffer like that? We did. And that's the difference. See, purpose in suffering is Jesus on the cross. Not because of the suffering, but because the suffering gets him to where he needs to be. And that he suffered there means that we can find purpose in our suffering and be forever changed. That we can ask these same questions and have the best answer. God gets the glory through my suffering. It's not that this world would be less painless, but instead that the pain that we go through would get us to know God and get us to become who God wants us to be. It says this in Psalms. It says, because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. There's a purpose change. Do we really look at God? Do we really look at Jesus and say, you're more important to me than life? We are to the point to where we need to flip that over. We need to stop looking at the sufferings of life and stop looking at where we are in our lives and trying to figure out how to make it less suffering and make it better for ourselves and then change it instead to say, you know what, all of this stuff, whatever. God, you are more important to me than life. See, when you say that, when you honestly believe that God is more important than life, life and its sufferings become second hand. Now you've changed. Now you experience suffering and you smile. Now you lose somebody and you deal with the pain and you deal with the sadness because it'll be there. But instead you stand up and you are somebody that somebody can rely on. And you move forward with the confidence because this life is meaningless compared to the glory that is God. And now things have changed. Now suffering takes a back seat to the glory that's God. And you will be immensely rewarded for your focus on God over everything else. And I don't mean rewards like you can attain better things in life. I mean that you can experience life in a way you haven't experienced it before. Because ask yourself, is the way that I'm managing my suffering now preventing future suffering better? I know it's not working for me. But we can change our view of life if we focus on God more than life. Now God becomes more important. Now we put him first, and suffering takes a back seat. You know, searching for a cause will just drive us insane. Trying to figure out why we're dealing with the suffering in life, trying to figure out why you got cancer, try and figure that out. Try and figure out why you have a disease. Try and figure out why you're going to die in 3 months. Try and figure out why you lost your child. Try and figure out why you don't have a job right now. You can't pay for bills. You don't have any food. Try and figure that out. You can't. You can't figure out suffering without knowing who God is. And if you know who God is, you want to put him first in your life ahead of your suffering, and then your suffering is explained to glorify God. People will look at you and they'll think you're insane because now in the midst of all of this pain and nastiness, you are stronger. You're dependable. People can rely on you, and yet it's falling around at your sides and you just don't care. I've said it a lot. You know, if I end up under a bridge somewhere with nothing, great. I'm fine with that. Because I know God will take care of me because God makes all things work to our good. And we may get through this life with nothing. We may get through this life having never succeeded. We may get through this life with no friends or family. But if we know who God is, our eternity will be incredible. Because that was more important than where we are right now. Searching for a cause will drive us insane, but searching for purpose will drive us to God. And when we are driven to God, we experience life and its suffering differently. When we're driven to God, when we find the purpose in him, now suffering always comes from sin changes. It becomes, be transformed by your suffering. Be somebody different. Don't be a victim. Know who God is. Enjoy life, even in the midst of its suffering. Nothing sums this up better than this verse, I don't think. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for this light, momentary affliction, all of this. Jesus said, do not be surprised by this fiery ordeal. It's like one of my favorite verses right now. Because there's nothing that gives me more joy and confidence in the fact that this is supposed to be this way. And when I read that verse, when I read this one, and it says, for this light momentary affliction, he's talking about everything. He's saying everything here. This is just a momentary thing. That you may never get what you want. You may never end up with exactly what you've asked for. You may never be 100% happy. But when we understand that where we're at is momentary, it's a blip. That eternity with the God who created us becomes the focal point of our lives and the most important thing. Our suffering just goes away. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. It's not for me to stand up here and act like a crazy person because I see this and go, this is amazing. It's for all of us. All of us to know that the eternity that we have waiting for us after this life means everything. And that this life here is to serve God so we can get there. Then we see our suffering in a different light. We see our suffering from a place that can find joy. We can lose a loved one. We can lose our money. We can lose our stuff. We can be in a place where there's nobody else around us, and we can still find solace and comfort in a God who works all things to our good. 2 Corinthians 4:17, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. When we look not to the things that are in our lives that cause us pain, in the things that we've lost, in the darkness that we're in, as we look not to those things, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. They're whispers. They're wind. It's words in the wind. It's nothing. Suffer today, smile tomorrow. How are we going to get through this? How are we going to work together? We're going to be a church family that supports each other, helps each other through this suffering? Or instead, are we going to sit down? We're going to do nothing because where I'm at is less suffering than where I might have to go. Instead, take joy in who God is. Take joy in this momentary affliction. That eternity is greater than anything we're at right here. Stand up. Be a strong, reliable person that takes joy in who God is in the suffering, not absent of suffering. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. You see, when we don't have a God, when we don't believe that God is real, when we're an atheist or whatnot, or we don't understand, we don't have anything to rely on. We got 80 years here, let's make them the best, and when I hit the dirt, fine, it'll be a black curtain fall and we'll be done. But if we know who God is, we have a different view of life. Life doesn't end when we hit the dirt. Life begins. And if we see the beginning of our life in an eternity, then we know right here in the midst of this suffering, this is nothing. It's okay. We got this. To those of you who are out here now, suffering, who have the darkness in your mind that you've told nobody, the fact that you still put on a fake smile sometimes and go to work, but on the inside you're just ruins. Find purpose in your suffering. Know that here today is never more important than where we'll be tomorrow. And that this fiery ordeal shouldn't be a surprise. Because someday we'll be in the glory of God who created us, who didn't make accidents, who didn't turn his back to those who were suffering, but instead worked all those things to his good. And then when we experience the suffering in our lives, we will be different. We won't be controlled by it. We won't be beaten by it. We'll see those things. We'll stand up strong. And if we have to suffer a bit more to get through it, we will do it. Because it's not important about the suffering here. It's important about the eternity there. Suffering is not always come from your sin. But we have to be transformed by that suffering. And when we are, we will know that God has a better plan for us, even if we don't know it. Because God is here. He is real. He sees our suffering, and he has a plan to make that suffering work to his glory, even if we don't know why. Find purpose, and you will be driven to God. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, you are everything. I praise you for your comfort, for your peace, for your guidance, for your real hand over us during our suffering. Father, for the people that are here today suffering, for the people who have suffering in their lives that just can't tell somebody else, you understand that. You know that. It's not an accident. Father, we pray that you would give them peace, that you would give them something to overcome that, to know that today is just a bump in the road and that eternity is forever. Father, help us find our focus on you. Help us to really love you more than life itself, because we know that if we love you more than life, the suffering that comes from it will be nothing. In Jesus' name.